You've probably seen it, right? If you've spent any time online, you've almost certainly come across the story of the Irish slaves. It's this really powerful narrative that just explodes across social media, especially around St. Patrick's Day. But, as you might have guessed, behind all those viral memes and angry articles lies a history that is way more complicated.
Yeah, you'll see posts just like this one, filled with absolutely shocking numbers and really bold claims. They talk about hundreds of thousands of Irish people being sold into a brutal form of slavery that they say history has conveniently forgotten. And listen, it's designed to grab your attention, to make you stop scrolling, and it works. It's incredibly effective.
So what is really going on here? Is this some hidden chapter of history that's been deliberately covered up, or is something else entirely at play? To figure that out, we've got to separate the facts from the fiction.
Okay, first things first, we have to tackle the numbers because, honestly, this is where the whole myth really begins to unravel. The claims are massive, so let's put them under a microscope. 300,000. This is the big one. It's the number you'll see thrown around most often, claiming that this many Irish people were sold as slaves in just a single decade in the 1600s. I mean, that's a staggering figure. Now, here's the number from actual historical scholarship. The best estimates we have suggest that somewhere around 10 to 12,000 Irish people were forcibly transported during that exact same period. Now, don't get me wrong, that is a horrific number, but it's a universe away from 300,000.
And this chart just lays it all out, crystal clear. That huge first bar, that's the meme's claim, 300,000 people in just 10 years. Now look at the second bar. That's the total number of people who migrated from Ireland over a century and a half, and it's only about 165,000. The meme's claim isn't just an exaggeration, it's a statistical fantasy. It's basically impossible.
And then you get this other common claim, that more Irish people were enslaved than Africans during the 17th century. This one is maybe the most dangerous falsehood of them all. The reality is, the transatlantic slave trade was operating on a completely different and just a vastly more horrific scale.
And we don't have to guess. This table, it's based on data from the Slave Voyages database, and it gives us the hard numbers. During that same period in the 1600s, over 1.8 million Africans were captured and sold into chattel slavery by Europeans. The scale isn't just different, it's not even in the same ballpark. It's not a valid comparison.
So, if the numbers are so wrong, what is the true story? Well, it's not a story of chattel slavery, but it is an absolutely brutal history of forced indentured servitude. And trust me, the reality is harrowing enough all on its own, no exaggeration needed.
Look at this. This is an actual order from 1653. It gave merchants official authorization to round up people they considered rogues, vagabonds, idlers, and wanderers, and literally ship them to the American colonies. This was a state-sanctioned system of forced labor targeting the poorest and most vulnerable people.
And we have their own words. We know what this felt like from the people who lived it. In 1661, two men, Philip Welch and William Downing, testified in a Massachusetts court, and their words are just chilling. We were brought out of our own country contrary to our own wills and minds and sold here. They were actually suing for their freedom after 7 years of being forced to work.
Another witness, a man named John King, described how people were literally kidnapped in the middle of the night, stolen out of their beds, and forced onto ships. He talked about seeing others weeping and crying because they were stolen from their friends. So this wasn't just some abstract policy, it was violent abduction.
So what happened? Well, the whole system just spiraled into this criminal free-for-all. Merchants were paid per person, so they started kidnapping anyone they could get their hands on, Irish and English alike. The abuses got so out of control, so rampant, that the English government itself had to step in and shut the whole program down in 1657.
So where in the world did these wildly inaccurate stories even come from? Well, the myth has its own strange family tree, a kind of genealogy of misinformation that you can actually trace back over more than a century.
It's basically a century-long game of historical telephone. It all starts in 1903, when an Irish-American doctor, Thomas Addis Emmet, just makes this unsubstantiated claim about 100,000 children being sold into slavery. Then, the famous socialist James Connolly repeats it in 1915. And then, decades later, in 1991, a white supremacist author named Michael Hoffman II cites Connolly, and that cements the myth in extremist circles, from where it eventually just leaks out onto the mainstream internet. And here it is, the origin. This is the actual passage from Dr. Emmeret's book from 1903. Over 100,000 young children were sent abroad into slavery. Notice what's missing? A footnote, a source. any evidence at all. This key part of the myth really does seem to have been invented out of thin air.
This is a perfect example of how a real fact gets completely twisted. So fact, a 1637 census of the island of Montserrat showed that 69% of its white inhabitants were Irish. Okay? But over time online, people just dropped those two crucial words, white inhabitants. And so the claim mutated into something totally different, that 69% of the entire population of the island were Irish slaves. It's a masterclass in how to distort history.
You know, debunking a myth is important, but it kind of leaves a void. So let's replace this false story of Irish heritage with a true one. A story that's even more incredible, because it's not written in memes, it's written in our very genes.
Well, the answer, believe it or not, might be found with a 5th century warlord and the powerful genetic signature he left behind.
So first, we need to know about something called Y-DNA haplogroup RM222. I know, it sounds technical, but just think of it as a genetic clan name. It's a specific marker on the Y chromosome that gets passed, almost unchanged, from father to son through generations. And it turns out it's found in a huge percentage of men with Irish roots. So geneticists at Trinity College Dublin traced this marker back, and they found that it most likely originates with one single, incredibly prolific man who lived around the 5th century, the legendary Irish High King, Niall of the Nine Hostages.
This chart just shows his staggering legacy. Today, an estimated 8% of all men in Ireland carry this genetic signature, but that number jumps to a whopping 21%. That's more than 1 in 5 men in northwestern Ireland, which was his historical homeland. We're talking millions of men alive today who are his direct descendants. How wild is that?
So this kind of leaves us with a choice in the stories we tell. On one hand, you have a fabricated past, built on false numbers and used to distort history. But on the other, there's a much deeper heritage, one that's grounded in both the brutal, real experiences of indentured servants and this incredible, scientifically proven story of ancestry that connects millions back to a single figure from the age of myths.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? When we push past the noise of the internet and look at the real evidence, whether it's in old court records or right there in our DNA, the true stories we find are often so much more fascinating than the myths they replace. What other stories are just waiting to be discovered?